Okay, mate, what is your second tip, please?
Right, so let me just move on here. Right, the second tip, right, one of the, again, this is related to something that I saw actually this morning on TV. I don't know if you watched Good Morning Britain this morning. You're probably too busy, aren't you, to watch Good Morning Britain. But I was watching it this morning, and the head teacher of Michaela was on there. I'm sure you've probably had her on your podcast before, haven't you? I'm sure. And she was talking about math students and physics students being primarily boys. And I think she got taken out of context in what she said, and there was another, I think it was a professor on there talking about how wrong she was, that we need to open up all these different avenues for boys and girls, etc., and make it as equal as we possibly can. But one thing that I've found in languages is that boys in general find languages are maybe not cool. And I know that's very hard to believe, looking at me, looking at my haircut. But they find it, and especially because they're exposed. Usually, I've always been one of the only male languages teachers in my department. It is primarily a female-led department that I've worked in. And those role models just aren't there for boys, really. I always try to try and sort of shoehorn in, famous celebrities, like we always remember, like Romelu Lukaku. He speaks this many languages, and the kids love that, and they're amazed by it. But boys, they really struggle with that engagement. So what I had a number of years ago was I had a bottom set, and you'd probably call it a sync group, a group where they were bottom sets. They were in year 9. They definitely weren't going to take French any further, and it was Spanish. Sorry, they weren't going to take Spanish any further. And it was basically me with them for a year trying to teach them Spanish, knowing that they didn't want to be there, knowing that they weren't very good at it really, and that they would rather be doing something else.
A mixture of boys and girls in the class, was it?
Primarily boys. Primarily there was a handful of girls. But what my next tip is being creative in how we can engage boys in the classroom. And what the idea that I had was that the boys that, and for this particular class, I would say that more than any class in my entire teaching career, and as I said before, I've been teaching for 16 years, I just couldn't get through to them. I couldn't, I feel like I'm quite a personable person in the classroom, and I think that normally I can find a way through to students, whether it's via, a common interest that we might have, or even just, just bigging them up in some sort of way. But I just could not get through to this class at all. I don't think they liked me at all for some reason. I think because they found the subject boring. So I was thinking, what can I do to ensure that these boys primarily are going to at least put a bit of effort in, because they weren't putting any effort in. Some boys in the class were not writing one single thing in the lesson. They just refused to write. And where do you go with that, especially when you're trying to get them to write in a foreign language? Like, where do we start there? So what I did was I created something called La Liga. So the league, that's the league for you, in Spanish. And what I did was I mixed the groups up. So I think it was only a smallish group. It was about 20 in the group, because it was a lower ability group. And I mixed them all up tactically as well. So trying to think, okay, well, I know that student argues with that student, so we can't have them together. And I know that this student runs out the room when this. So I knew I had to try and be as tactical as possible when I was arranging the class. And the idea was that they were all going to represent a football team, because the majority of the boys like football. And what I did was I chose Spanish football teams. So I chose Real Madrid, I chose Barcelona, and a few other football teams. And I said to them, right, what you're going to do is you're going to be representing this football team for a half term or even a full term or whatever. Now, one thing I will say is that the whole purpose of this, a bit like a game really, but this idea that I had, it was based on there was a report done, or some recommendation that came out of a report from the British Council, and I think it was in the year 2019, I think it was, where they were looking at boys and languages, and they spent a bit of time looking at some success stories across the UK. So there was a number of schools who were bucking the trend in terms of how the boys were performing. They were outperforming girls, and they were finding, okay, they were speaking to teachers, they were speaking to students, and saying, what is it that you're doing that is ensuring that these results are so good for boys? And they came up with a series of recommendations, and there was things like ensuring that they're well supported, that in your class you use humour, which you know that you've always struggled with, and things like competitive activities that we know always works well with boys. But one of them was the use of rewards and sanctions, and rewards was the one I wanted to hone in on. So this La Liga idea is a long-term reward, and I've never been one for you know, having sweets in the classrooms. I just think they are such short-term fixes, and in the end they just create more problems than they solve. But one thing I would say is that I introduced this as a long-term reward. So over maybe a half term, 8 weeks and a half term, and I explained to the students, right, over this half term, we're going to be in groups, we're going to be working together as a group in teams against other teams in the room, and the prize at the end of our 8 weeks is, and I tried to guess what they wanted, and I would say, right, we can have a can of Coke each, and we can have some crisps or sweets each in the classroom. So in our last class of term, you can enjoy that in front of everybody else. You can be, you can boast about it, and you can rub it in their faces in that last lesson of term. So straight away, I hooked them in with that, because you don't get that, do you? Normally, you don't get that opportunity to do stuff like that. So I sort of dangled that carrot, and I said to him, right, you're going to be representing a football team, and over the course of these 8 weeks, what you can do is you can score these fictional goals for your team. So you can score points for your team. And I said there are 4 ways in which you can do that. You can either you can behave well. So one of the big issues was behaviour. They just would not. When I was talking, they just would not listen. They were talking over me. They were having conversations between themselves. So one thing, I knew I had to do something about that. So I said, if you are behaving well, if you're displaying positive behaviour in the classroom, then you can earn points for your team. If you answer a question right by putting your hand up, because what they were doing, they were all shouting out. So I said to him, right, if you can put your hand up and I ask you what the answer is, and you get that question right, or you give a really good go, then you can earn some points for your team that way. I also said that you can earn points by asking an interesting question. So if you can show some real real interest in how the language works, or you can maybe in conversation with one of your peers, if you can come up with a really good idea that shows me you're being enthusiastic about our subject, then that's another way you can earn points as well. And I think another one was if you score well in a test or an assessment, to try and get them into the sort of mindset of working hard outside the classroom as well. So they were the sort of 4 ways in which they could earn points. But I did say to them as well, you can actually lose points as well, and you can lose points by shouting out or getting your name on the board if that's your thing. That's not my thing, but if you're shouting out, not behaving well, and if you, I think I said, what was the other thing I said? I think it was not behaving well, and not doing your work, not doing the work that's set in the lesson. That was it. And I explained that to them, and one of the key things that I said to them was, do you think you might fancy having a go at this then for this half term? And they were all dead enthusiastic. Yeah, it sounds brilliant, yeah. So getting their buy-in and getting their agreement that it was a good idea, first and foremost, really important. And then I said to them, so is this something that you think might be good in terms of improving your language skills? And they were like, yeah, we'll give it a go. Yeah. So they were really enthusiastic about it, and because they knew what the end goal was as well, what the prize was, they all bought into it. But even when I introduced it, I still found there was still a bit of pushback from a certain number of students. I'd say 1 or 2 students when I first introduced it anyway. And they're the students, aren't they? You know, the students who, no matter what you introduce, they're going to try and sabotage it. They're going to try and, right, what can I do to Mr. Bartland's lesson here to ensure that it goes off track? So what you have to do with them students is you've got to try and think, okay, well, what I'll do here is I'm just going to try as best I can to be as tactical as possible and try and get them on board as quickly as I can. So what I introduced was team captains. So I invested in some captain's armbands from eBay. They were like, I think we did 10 for 5 or something. So each team had a team captain each lesson, and that team captain was rotated every lesson. And I ensured that the students who I knew were most likely to disrupt it or not buy into it were the captains for the first team. So that they had a bit of responsibility. They knew that they were going to be representing their team, so they did that with a bit of pride. So that was the first thing I did. And also at the end of each lesson, when I've collated all the points and things about how they've done, then what I did was at the start of the next lesson I had a league table, so like a running league table. So at the start of each lesson, when I turned my whiteboard monitor on, the screen would come in, and when whiteboards come on, they sort of fade in, don't they? So I put it on the screen, and everyone would be like looking at it, looking at the league table and you know, cheering if they were in the lead and maybe being disappointed if they weren't near the top. But what I would also do is, and I don't know where you sit ethically on this, but I would fix it a little bit so that everyone was very, very close.
Yes.
So that, because you know, if one team were lagging behind, then there's no incentive for them to carry on. So I was a bit tactical with it, to be honest, and I have been ever since, just to ensure that everyone's bought into it and everyone's taking part. But what the beauty of it, and I would say that in my teaching career of 16 years, this is the thing I'm most proud of, because when it comes to once the students are bought into it, you can visibly see that they're all engaged. You can visibly, you could give them a task and you say, okay, well, this is a task where we're actually competing against everyone else in the classroom, and the students will be like, okay, even the most disengaged boys are working away, but they start to manage each other. The beauty of it is they start to manage themselves, their own behaviour, and then if a teammate of theirs is not behaving well or not putting the right effort in, because they know they can lose points, because it's a collective entity, isn't it? It's a team game. Then they're saying, come on, you need to make sure you're doing this, because Sarah will take a point. And it just works so well. And I said, once they've bought into it, it just looks after itself, and you don't really have to do much. It's just you facilitate the room rather than having to sort of pick students up on the poor behaviours. But it's something which, I said, I would say is probably the thing that I'm most proud of over the course of my teaching career, because it's something which I know that if I'm not getting through to a particular class, and it's usually the boys who aren't buying into what I'm doing, then I can wheel this out. I can just say, right, well, what we're going to do, we're going to try this. And funnily enough, I remember that I had a year 9 French group, about 3 or 4 years ago, and there was a lad in there who was probably the most poorly behaved boy in school. Really was terribly behaved. And I'm not saying that in my lessons he was an angel, he wasn't. But what I remember in year 11, I was at the prom, and he hadn't taken French for 3 years, since year 9. And he said to me, I used to love your lessons, you know, and that game we played, and he still remembered it. And he was like, I used to love earning points, and that was, and he didn't say it was really motivational, like really he didn't say it like that, of course he didn't. But he said, I actually looked forward to that competition we were doing. And that's good enough for me. I wasn't attempting to make him, you know, into the world's best linguist, but what I was trying to get him to do was to engage in my lessons, and he was engaged. So that's La Liga, or the league. But it's something which I've found as a long-term reward has worked really well.
That's brilliant, mate. I love the sound of this. So I've got a couple of questions, a few of them obvious ones. And first, like, how do you know it worked? Did you have anything to compare? Like, did those kids...
Did you not just hear me compelling story about that lad?
Tears are in my eyes here. But I just, with the group as a whole, did they perform better than perhaps they would be expected against targets or anything?
Yeah, funnily enough, I had a TA. You usually get a TA with those lower ability groups, don't you? Yeah. And at the start, I always remember what this lad said when he first entered my group in year 9. He looked around the room, because it's setted. He looked around the room and he said, oh, this group's heavy, isn't it? Because of all the characters in there. I thought, oh God, is that going to be that bad, is it? And the teaching assistant said, this class are a nightmare across the school. But the feedback she was giving me was, this is really working. She was saying, this game is something they talk about in other lessons, and they ask other teachers, can we play a game that we do in French? So I know that, you know, sort of speaking to other teachers and, you know, second hand, third hand, that it works. And I'd say in terms of I wouldn't say that in terms of the engagement with the students, that's not the thing that I'm honing. If we're looking at how they perform, I wouldn't say there's a massive difference. I wouldn't say that you know, those students are taking French when they weren't going to take French before. That's not what I was in it for. I was in it for ensuring that the students were engaged in my lessons, so they were getting something out of it. They were working hard. They were getting something from it. But one thing that I did always do with those lower ability groups was have a sort of cultural side of it, because they struggle with the language side of it. I had a cultural element to almost all of my classes with those groups. So ensuring they were appreciative of other cultures, and that, you know, just developing their knowledge that way rather than the linguistic, because the linguistic way, unfortunately, was not for them really. But just broadening their horizons, thinking about the world being bigger than, you know, the four walls of our classroom. was really important for me, and getting them to engage in that debate when it comes to how important languages are and where they sit in their lives, because a lot of the students that I dealt with, a lot of their attitudes bordered on the xenophobic quite a lot of the time, which is really sad. But I would say that engaging them this way and getting them to engage with, whether it was a reading task or even it could even just be a video that I've shown, and I'll ask them questions on the video about how people live in other countries who speak French, whatever it might be. I can just see that. I know it's probably not you want something measurable, don't you? But all I can say is what I can see from the students' engagement, and that was all positive, really.
A really obvious question here, mate. Well, what about the kids who either don't like footy or don't like the competitive element? Was that an issue or not?
Not really, no. Football was obviously the first way in that I utilised, but I did. What else did I do? I did monuments across Europe. So I did like the Eiffel Tower, Brandenburg Gate, things like that. So they were representing that. They represent countries. So I think there was a World Cup on at one particular time, so it shows Spanish-speaking countries. So it doesn't have to be to do with football. It just lent itself well, because that particular group that I started it with, they primarily, they love football. I don't know whether you might be asking me in a second, or you might be thinking about the girls in the classroom as well, and how they reacted to it. I always think that when you say to students, we're going to play a game now, because I know that you boys really competitive. The girls are competitive as well. The girls want to win as well. It's not just something a trait that boys have. Girls like competing as well. And I've found that in the lessons, that as long as the girls are in the right group, and usually they do like to be with at least one other girl in the group, they buy into it as well, and they get as much out of it as the boys do. So I say something which I've been really proud of, and something which, as I said before, seems to work all the time, and it's something which I can just rely upon as being something which will maybe turn a certain number of students around. And I know that over that 8-week period, or 7 weeks, whatever it might be in a term, that I've got them where I want them. And then obviously the beauty of that is that you get a better relationship with them then. Once they've opened up a little bit and they're competing, you can have a bit of, I don't know, use the word banter, but you can have a bit of a conversation with them, you can have a bit of relationship with them. They're more likely then, if you try something else with them, to go with you on that. And that's just been something which I said before is that I've seen play out in reality. That because one other thing that I've done with them as well on the back of that is that once it's over, the students are, what are we going to do now? We can't just go back to those boring lessons you were doing before, can we? So one other thing that I did was I called it Le Magasin de Mumford. What does that mean? Le Magasin.
Oh, the magazine.
You should know. No, come on.
Shop.
There you go. So what I did was I called it Le Magasin de Mumford. So what I did was same principle. So you earn points, in fact it was euros that I printed off, all random euros, fake euros, and I said you can earn euros for the same principles that I mentioned earlier on. And then at the end of that 8 weeks, I'll bring in a certain number of crisps and drinks and things, and if you order them in French, or I gave them a bit of help with the French as well, then you can buy certain things. So everyone was involved in that. So because everyone was earning euros, there was no sort of winner as such, but they could all buy into that as well, literally buy into it at the end of it.
So a few things to say. This is just going to be a big, long, rambling point, mate, so God knows if there's any sense in this at all. One thing that feels really powerful about this is that it's a long-term reward, as you say. You're not having to reward them at the end of each lesson or anything like that, and then it doesn't become about the short term, it becomes about the long term. That feels important. The other thing that feels important is that the points are rewarded for a variety of kind of behaviours that you want to see in the classroom. You can imagine with like a mixed attainment group, if you were always giving points for correct answers, it's always going to be the same kids at the top and stuff. But it sounds to me like you're rewarding kids for behaving well, being considerate, putting their hands up, asking questions and so on. So that feels like an important part of this as well. Yeah,
and as I said, because the team captains played an important role as well, because they were cyclical, they were getting changed each lesson. You could see that the more able students really helping the less able students as well, and you could see that the less able students growing, having that responsibility as well, from not really contributing much in lessons to then having that responsibility. Obviously some students are quite shy at first, aren't they, but when they can see that they've got a question right and their teammates say, oh, well done, you've earned some points there, you can see the confidence growing visibly.
It sounds like when I was first listening, I'm thinking this is going to be quite hard for you to be recording, keeping track of all these points and so on. And I also was thinking, just before you said it, about if a group's at the bottom, it's really demotivating. But it sounds like, as you say, you're fiddling it a little bit, and maybe you're not that obsessed with tracking every single point here, there and everywhere. Would that be right? Yeah,
it is right. What I did, one issue that I did find actually, somewhat taking the points down was, what I used to do was I'd print off I'd have the seating plan written out or printed out, and then I'd just use a bit of a tally chart for the points. But then obviously, day-to-day life, you're like, I haven't printed off the chart here, what am I going to do? So then you're using like a whiteboard or something, it didn't work. So what I did was I laminated the seating plan, so that whenever I was in a lesson, I'd have like a little clipboard, so the students knew it was like an official thing as well. So I'd have a little clipboard, make the notes, and then at the end of the lesson, put the points into the lead table, and then just wipe it off and go on the next lesson.
That's really nice. Final couple of points from me, mate, on this. The group norms feels like a really important part of this. As you say, you've got kids who are always going to try and disrupt things, but the power of the group there, if you can get those kids on board short term, and then the group dynamics take over and stuff, that feels really powerful. And it reminds me of Sammy Kempner, who came on the show, who's head of maths at Totteridge Academy. I've been a group work skeptic for many years, but Sammy really got me on board here, and one of the things he talked about was how the group was really responsible for the performance of the individual, so much so that he said that, and this blew my mind, he'd ask a kid a question in a group, and if that kid got it wrong, the rest of the group were dead, essentially, because he was blaming them for it. It was like, why doesn't he know this? We're working together, we're all one. And again, it feels to me like this fits in perfectly well with this. It really fosters really strong group dynamics, and everyone's looking after each other because they've got that added incentive too.
It's one of those as well where you're looking at a kid and you're thinking, that kid doesn't want to be here, that kid doesn't like this lesson, and then you see them as you're observing or as you're walking around the room, really engaged, helping somebody else, and you're like, this is working, and this is something which you need to to build upon. But yeah, it definitely does work.